So for a very long time, I wondered why some people seem to have engaging conversations with almost anyone they meet, whereas I was often stuck in ones that were a bit awkward and uncomfortable. Until, after reading more than 55 books on the topic, I realized that most of it was due to 5 simple communication mistakes I used to make and that I still see a lot of other people making. So in this video we'll go over the 5 communication mistakes you need to avoid, as well as what to do instead to also have more engaging and interesting conversations with almost anyone you meet. Alright, so the first mistake is the reason that ever so often you're stuck in a conversation where you and the other person have absolutely no idea what to talk about, with lots of awkward silences and uncomfortable small talk. Because in almost all of these conversations, you and the other are simply not developing or planting enough of so-called conversational branches. So let's look at a very common conversation. Hey, how's your trip to Morocco? Man, it was amazing. Yeah? Was it your first time there? Yeah, it was my first time there. Have you been there too? Yeah, I have been there too. You see, the conversation is actually not that bad because both ask a lot of questions and seem to actually be interested in talking with the other. But simply by planting a little bit more of conversational branches, the conversation could easily become way more engaging. So for instance, it could look like this. Hey, how was your trip to Morocco? Man, it was amazing. I finally learned how to kitesurf, the culture was so cool, and the food was incredible. Now the other person has a lot of branches on where to develop the conversation. You can talk about kitesurfing, you can talk about oriental food, or you can ask about unique culture. Simply because the other gave an answer that was a bit more detailed and a bit more personal. And you can do this in almost every conversation and it really will make a massive difference. But the even bigger mistake here was the type of questions that both of the conversationalists were asking. Which brings us to the second communication mistake. Okay, so sticking to the conversational tree, all conversations can actually be broken down into 4 categories. Talking about the other person, such as their experiences, their feelings, or what they do on most days. Talking about yourself with the same subtopics. Talking about the current situation, such as the weather, everybody's favorite, or talking about something extraordinary that just happened, or talking about a specific topic, such as a current trip you did, or a movie you both watched, or a memory you both shared. And that's it. However, the main mistake that people make is that in conversations that already don't flow, that already have a lot of silences, that they ask questions that only relate to a single sub-branch. For instance, what do you want to study, or what job are you currently doing? Which is an okay question if the conversation is already going great. But for these other conversations, it would be much better to ask something like, how do you spend most of your time? Because now the other person is still probably going to talk about their job or their studies, but they might also talk about their hobbies or something they actually care about. Meaning, now they can talk about multiple sub-branches. And best of all, most of the questions that relate to the whole tree start with how, what, or why. What was your highlight of the last week? How did you enjoy the kitesurfing in Morocco? Why do you like the food so much? Or what caused you to study law? Which all cover multiple branches or reveal a bit more about who the other person is, and thus can turn the conversation from boring and awkward to pretty good. However, here comes the most common mistake that almost everybody makes. And this took me years to figure out, but it really has a detrimental effect on almost all your conversations. Okay, so how often have you come home and a family member asked you, hey, how's school? And you probably answered, pretty good. Or what about if I would ask you, hey, how's life? You'd probably still answer pretty good as well. But they are open-ended questions. They relate to multiple branches. You could answer so many things. But do you see the problem with them? They are so open-ended that you have so many things you could mention that most of the time you freeze up and you answer something that leads nowhere. But we're doing this way more often than we are currently realizing. For instance, I was on a trip for 4 months around South America and so many people asked me, man, how did you like it? And again, I could mention so much, but most times I answered something like, yeah, it was incredible. However, just a few people asked me questions that were just a bit more personal or a bit more detailed. What was my highlight? Why did I travel to these exact countries? And how did I do it with my job? And every single time, these type of questions led to a way more interesting answer, but I also actually felt like the person was interested in hearing from me instead of just quickly checking in with me. And just changing this one seemingly little thing really made a massive difference on my conversations. However, if you do this, you're also more likely to commit the fourth mistake, which I call the interview. How have you been? Tell me more. How's the family? What are you doing in life? Question after question after question after question, which probably will make the other person feel drained after a while. But it's so easy to avoid this, because all you need to do to never make the other person feel like it's an interview is to, again, ever so often give answers yourself that are a bit more detailed, a bit more personal, or ever so often throwing in a predictive statement instead of asking yet another question. So for instance, instead of asking, how was Morocco? You can say, what, you've been to Morocco? You must have had an amazing time. Or instead of asking how the other person is doing, you can simply state that they seemed super happy since a couple of weeks, which really helps turn from an interview to more of a natural, two-sided conversation. But probably the biggest communication mistake you need to avoid is the next one. It has all to do with small talk. You see, when I think back to some of the worst conversations I had in the last couple of months, I always felt like the other person just wanted to talk about anything, just to avoid the otherwise awkward silences we might have. So we talked about the weather, meaningless topics, and that's exactly what I call small talk. And you know, when you're in a rush or when you don't really know how to get a conversation going, I think it's fine to start with small talk, but just think back to some of the best conversations you ever had. I bet you that most of them skipped the small talk altogether and either were around a topic that both of you are really interested in, or led to both of you to find out more about each other. And if you ask questions that are not too open-ended, make some predictive statements here and there, and then also give answers that are a bit more personal and detailed, you can have these type of conversations with basically anyone. If of course that's the type of conversation that you would like to have.